ocean's whisper calls my name. Depth and longing in my soul, seeking more than just this game. Waves crash softly at my feet, echoes in my heart so deep. Eyes on horizon far and true, longing for a love so steep. Deep calls to deep inside of me, where the sky meets endless sea. Heartbeats blend with ocean's roar, seeking depth I can't ignore. Echoes in my heart so deep, eyes on horizon far and true, longing for a love so steep. Deep calls to deep inside of me, where the sky meets endless sea. Heartbeats blend with ocean's roar, seeking depth I can't ignore. Shells and sand beneath my toes, tides reveal what ebb and flows. In the quiet still I hear whisper longings crystal clear. Deep calls to deep inside of me, where the sky meets endless sea. Heartbeats blend with ocean's roar, seeking depth I can't ignore. Desire, burning with a holy fire. Depth of love beyond all dreams, in the vastness it redeems. Deep calls to deep inside of me, where the sky meets endless sea. Heartbeats blend with ocean's roar, seeking depth I can't ignore.
All right. Hey, everybody. Welcome to A Deep Calls Deep, where every day we journey to dwell deeper with Yahweh. I am so excited about this conversation. I have been waiting to have this conversation for quite a while. And I think one of the big pieces was having, I think, the right person to have this conversation with. So I am so excited to welcome Spencer back. Some of you might remember him from our Leviticus video, which part 2 is in the works, and I'm very excited about that too. But this is going to be a little bit tougher of a conversation because we are going to talk about the hard parts in the Old Testament, the Bible. Like, how do we read those? So Spencer, why don't you just kind of introduce yourself a little bit again, tell everybody who you are and why I think this is going to be, I think, an awesome conversation.
Sure. So for those of you who don't know, my name is Spencer. I am a licensed psychotherapist, licensed professional counselor, and that's my day job. And the specialty that I work with in that job is with people who have experienced spiritual trauma or religious abuse. And so that's kind of like the area that I've kind of carved out for myself is what where I want to help and how I want to bring some healing in the area. As a supplement to that work, I also have started up a podcast called the Trauma Informed Church Kid. And the goal of that is to kind of walk through the entire Bible, starting with the Old Testament, and really putting on our trauma-informed lenses as we walk through the Bible, to really look at the ways in which certain texts and scriptures have been used to cause harm and to hurt and been manipulated and been a source of hurt rather than healing, and just to openly acknowledge that and affirm that and tell people they're not crazy for their discomfort that they have with the Bible because of that. And then hopefully, at least hopefully, God willing, to from there to then recreate a different experience of the Bible and of God through rebuilding a whole different way of looking at the text of Scripture. So that's, and by the way, when I say whole different, I don't mean like novel in the sense that Spencer made it up out of his head. Um,
Right.
an awful lot of what I do is about recovering on, especially like the patristic traditions and the way that they used to read the text, as well as going back to the ancient Near East context of a lot of these texts and understanding them in that context and the way that the original authors and audience would have understood it. And along the way, that does tend to create a much more beautiful experience of Yahweh. So,
Yeah, I think that I kind of want to start with just a basic, one of the most basic framing misunderstandings that I see, especially in the Old Testament, is a misunderstanding of what Torah itself is. Because a lot of people think it's this like meritorious, you thinking a list of rules of do's and don'ts and thou shalt nots, and it becomes like punitive courtroom where you have to defend yourself, and can become, it feels very accusatory
it
and can
does.
feel very judgmental. But Torah actually, because that the word, what we, a lot of people think of as the books of the law, is that word Torah itself means instructions. And
Yes.
it is also used in like Proverbs and other places for when it talks about a mother teaching her son. It is that word Torah. So, you know, it is basically instructions, guidelines, wisdom to live by. There are not that many thou shalts that are actually specifically mentioned that way. There are some, but not nearly as many as we think they are. And all of those, the intention of Torah is to convey the love of God. And that word there is the hesed, which is
Yeah.
beyond love. That is a beautiful word that takes like a
It
half an
really
hour to
is.
explain.
Yeah. Yeah.
But
Yeah.
it's this intentional, loving, caring view that it's about preservation of life. So, you know, the love of God preserving life is Torah. And so when we look at everything that comes after in those frame of references, Spencer, what does that do looking at the Old Testament when we start there?
Boy, it's such a subtle shift, but it makes such a big difference. Like the way that I think of it is, if we all start from Genesis 1, and then
Mhm.
one perspective kind of goes very slightly off in this way, and the other one kind of goes,
Mhm.
you do that for long enough, you wind up in very different places.
Yeah.
And that's kind of what I've discovered and what I've seen as I've been walking through myself and as I've been doing this process of uncovery and rediscovery, is that when we approach Torah and when we approach it as law, like in this very legal, penal, forensic framework, as being this is what God says do and don't do, it a sense of who God is in our head, that as a
Mhm.
maker or like a police officer, somebody who just is there to tell us, to kind of take away our fun for some people, to to smack us on the hand at any given moment. And that's really, I mean, that was a perspective that I remember growing up with, is this sense of, if I do anything wrong, like even the tiniest thing, then it's all over. Like I'm destined for hell. And taking that approach to the Bible really starts to warp and twist your sense of who God is. Like one of the episodes I did on my podcast was talking about how I had a moment where I encountered some beauty that really kind of reconnected me back to God. And it exposed to me a lot of the ways in which my attachment style to God was very, very, I mean, I suppose unhealthy is well, certainly insecure. Insecure is
Mhm.
probably the best way to say that, in large part because of that kind of penal perspective. So, yeah, whereas if we come at this and say, God is trying to give us um, give us the air that we need to breathe when he gives us Torah. He's trying to help us see who we were created to be and to gently get us into that space that totally changes the way that we connect to God.
Yeah, I want to just pause for just a second and just kind of give everybody sorry, a little bit of a trigger warning, because we are going to get into, as we go along, some tough topics. So, the Old Testament definitely has some gore. It definitely is some very difficult things that we're not going to get into all of them, and we're certainly not going to get into them graphically.
Mhm.
But there are some, there is
Mm.
things like genocide, there is murder, there's wrath, there's incest, there's some really tough things in there. So so if
Right.
those are sensitive, just be aware that we may get into some of that territory here as
Mhm.
we're going through. So
Yeah.
just be careful and gentle with yourself as you're going through these topics.
Mhm.
So yeah, and I want to start starting with Genesis 2. You don't get very far. You start with this beautiful picture of organizing chaos and this
Mhm.
creating space to fill space, and that comes out of loving desire to bless. And just how beautiful this picture of we get in Genesis 1, of the intentionality that goes into creation and creating
Mhm.
this perfect space that God puts man and puts humans into, that is a place because he wants to dwell with them. So not only is it this, out of this desire to dwell with us in a place that meets the necessities of the standards of his holiness, but
Mhm.
it's also this place where my biblical theology teacher, when we were going through and hit this part and talking about this idea, because it starts out Bereshit bara Elohim, and
Mhm.
in the one way that can be interpreted, and has been in some of the older Jewish interpretations and things, instead of just being stuck in thinking about it in the beginning, you can also think about it, because that word can also mean head. So that can come out of this idea of out of the imagination or out of the creativity, tapping into
Mhm.
this idea of beauty and this whole, how lovingly, and out of the imagination and the whimsy, I think we see in creation and some of this stuff, that this beautiful loving place is created. And
Mhm.
Genesis 2, we get to see some more of the mechanics of the details of the intentionality built into humans being created and put into creation.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, and then we get to chapter 3 and the wheels fall off, and then it gets hard, because what do we do with that? Because Adam and Eve, and they mess up, and then God has to put them out. And that, how does God reject people like that? To me, if you're not reading that through the lens of how God is loving, how does God rejecting, and if I do something wrong, does God reject me just the same way he did Adam and Eve?
Yes. Yeah. You are very much right with that narrative and how it like starts to run into problems right off the bat. Um, that I know you were putting out like a content warning at the beginning, but I'm also going to just make sure that I tell people that anything I say about these things is not designed to like erase discomfort. It's not designed to like make it all better and have whatever, the impact of these texts have been on people. It's not designed just to make it all go away and then, okay, well, now I have an answer that fully satisfies my logical brain. So all of a sudden, everything else is fine. I think a lot of times apologetic work tends to come at it from that perspective, and that's just the opposite of what I want to try to do. Hopefully, my goal in responding to any of these things is to create an encounter with beauty, to be able to
Mhm.
help people see the beauty that is there, rather than just simply like satisfying the intellect and making it, be resolved on that level. So just a little kind of slight caveat there. But In the podcast, when I was walking through that part of the text, that was a real thing that we wrestle with. Is why does God feel the need to kick them out? Like, they just messed up once. Like, couldn't he just accept a sorry? Like, why is this such a big deal? And not just that, but then the consequences of it are so huge. They're monumental, depending on which version of ancestral or original sin you're looking at. I mean, we're definitely looking at, all of human race. All of the human race is affected by this. One of the things that I discovered as I started to look deeper into that, the effects of the fall and the exile from Eden, is that it was seen as what you might call a severe mercy, and by that I mean specifically that in a lot of the understandings of the earliest centuries, they looked at the expulsion from paradise and they said that was a mercy from God to keep them from being forever crystallized in their sin. So because they had already fallen, because they had already accepted corruption into their being, because of just the nature of sin. I mean, the nature of sin, and again, now here's where the divergence of the penal view versus a different view comes. If we look at sin as being just simply breaking a rule, not doing what God says, then it seems to really, then any consequence or punishment that comes from that is like an inorganic, like external reality that then gets imposed in, and it's like a hammer coming down. Whereas if we take the approach that a lot of the earliest Christians had about sin, which is that it's a internal reality, it's a disease, it's a sickness, it's a way of being that fundamentally aligns oneself with death rather than life. And that's just a metaphysical necessity and reality. It's not something God comes in, like smacks people around the side and says, you didn't do what I expected you to do, so here's death. It's more like God is saying, I am life, and I'm the only source of life, and any choice away from me cuts you off from life. Not because I'm wanting to smack your hand, but because that's just what it means when you walk away from life. And so what happens then, and this is actually in the text of Genesis itself, where as he's pondering what to do after the Adam and Eve eat from the fruit, he says, well, if they eat from the fruit, eat from the tree of life, then, and then the text kind of goes ...
Right.
I mean, not really, but like the thought trails off. And a lot of the church fathers looked at that and said, well, that what the ending to that sentence is, they will eat the tree of life. They will have this corruption that is now inherent in their being will become concrete. Like right now, it's kind of fluid and malleable. If they eat from the tree of life, it will become hard and very much like Pharaoh or any of those other figures that get hardened. And so, and God says, I can't have that happen to my creatures. And actually, several church fathers say, if that would have happened, then the devil would have won. And
I think it's I think it's really interesting, this idea. When I came at it from a very different place. I got there in Hebrew class. We were talking about, because we spent an entire semester every week retranslating Genesis 1 through 5, and then just going through the narrative and talking about the implications of some of the language and grammar in the first 3 chapters. It was really fascinating. But as we were talking about that, and in OTBT, that looking at that as a shift to framing that from a mercy, and grammatically how that works better as a mercy, what that does when you're looking at that, and if you come out of a place where you grow up in a meritorious context, or in a context where you're everyone's favorite viper and diaper kind of thing, where you're just from birth, you're just, evil. When it's, you look
Good
at it
old
this
Vadi
way.
Bakum. Mhm.
But looking at it that way, and that was a mercy, that again, God is trying to preserve life, and in love preserving us from a lifetime eternity of suffering, that really changes the whole thing. And that God puts a limit on their suffering. They have the suffering that comes about because of a choice that they made. Not, we're not going to blame, but we're just saying the consequences happen, good or bad, so, but because God is loving and God is merciful, he gives them even a time limit on that. And that just, so God is not about inflicting suffering for eternity. That's not God's intention, and it never has been. So it just, to me, that really made a huge flip in how to
Yes.
read some of that stuff in a way that wasn't quite so hard. And it changes your whole view growing up, learning that everything, God is there to smack you with a hammer, because look at, he just made Adam and Eve and told them, if you do something wrong, you're going to drop dead. Well, it's not exactly what's happening there.
No.
It's,
Well, and just to make it really practical, I mean, like, this is something I've wrestled with my daughter, not only because as we try to, so to speak, catechize her, as she's growing up, but also because, um, and at one moment she actually asked me the question, like, "Daddy, why was there this other tree there that would hurt them? Like, why did God put it there?" And so that became a whole interesting conversation. But also because it really affects the way that I treat her, I've noticed. It's like the more that I try to understand this different view of God, that's not punitive, that's not focused, that doesn't have penal retribution at the center of his being, that really changes, or at least in my best moments, and even in my worst moments immediately thereafter, changes the way that I see and the way that I try to interact with her. Because if she's not doing what I tell her to, like I started to really try very hard, and with some to moderate success, separate between, am I upset because she's disobeying me, or am I upset because this is going to hurt her? Like,
right.
her choices will, and even if they won't hurt her today, right now, they will eventually hurt her. Kind of like it says in Genesis 2, where it says, if you eat from the fruit of this tree, dying you will die, or you will die the death.
Right.
And so it's not the sense of like, okay, well, if you don't do what I say, then I will have to, like, take something away from you, is how it might go with my daughter.
Right.
Versus more like a organic, natural consequence. So if anyone's familiar with like Love and Logic parenting styles, or like that's something that I really find to resonate an awful lot with that particular reading of scripture. Because one of the things that I say an awful lot on my podcast is, we become like what we worship. So if we worship a God who has to punish, like, punitively, not just like correct sin, but punish sin. There's a vast difference between those two things. If we worship a God who has to, like, smack down sin in some way in order to be just, then that really changes how we interact on a daily basis with all the people around us.
Yeah. And we see that again. We don't get very far. We get one chapter later, and we've got another family situation on our hands there in Genesis chapter 4. We got Cain and Abel and that whole situation. And we get into family murder, because we've got Cain and Abel bring, which I find this really, really interesting, because all of this is happening before we don't have Torah. We don't have, Abraham's not even on the scene yet. But they're offering sacrifices. They're bringing offerings to God, which I find fascinating how that even happened, and who taught them how to do that, and that whole process. But that's a whole different topic. But
Yeah.
you see them
There's a
come,
whole rabbit hole there.
There is.
Yes.
But the brothers come, they bring their offerings, and Abel brings his offering from that he brought with the meat offering, and
Mhm.
then and then Cain comes with the kind of, to me, the way that works grammatically there, and kind of the picture that's painting, it's kind of like, this is not the
Yeah.
best of the best, but it's
Yeah.
what I got. I give you, I'll take out the couple best myself, and then I'll bring from what's left.
Mhm.
But you can look at that and see, and if you see God as punishing already, it's like,
Mhm.
well, why is God punishing Cain? What's wrong with Cain's offering that he brought? And even I think if Cain had brought his best, but his heart wasn't in the right place, I
Right.
think it goes back to that center of who you're worshiping. You become like who you're worshiping, and
Mhm.
but does it set a situation up where we get sibling rivalry, and one brother kills the other brother because God rejected one and not the other because of the thing that they brought? So this external determines whether God loves me or not. And it just,
Right.
that really can, even further, if you're already on the fence of God having to punish, now he's, creating jealousy situations where one brother has to do better than the other.
Mhm.
And so, Spencer, talk about that a little bit and what that does.
Oh boy. Yeah. Um, there's the story of Cain is a fascinating one. Um, and I think the best way to approach that is, as always, to really dive into the text, to really sit with it. And if it makes you uncomfortable, don't just close the book and walk away if you can. I mean, I get it. There are
Mm-hmm.
times where people, that's the best thing to do for their uh, health and well-being, for their shalom, and that's fine. I mean, God will work in sometimes quick ways and sometimes slow ways, and that's okay. But one of the things we see in the story of Cain is that, first of all, God doesn't just smite him right away.
Right.
He goes to Cain and he says, "Hey, um, you know that, like, I believe he says, like, why is your face down fallen?" Or so
Mm-hmm.
he's saying, like, it seems like you're really upset. Talk to me. Like, what's going on
Mm-hmm.
here? If you do right, will you not be accepted? So, like, he's right at that moment. Adonai is saying, I'm ready to accept you. Like, we are good. I mean,
Right.
I didn't accept the offering because the it wasn't given in the right way, and not just like you didn't follow the checklist, but your heart is in the totally wrong place here. And I didn't accept the offering, but all I need for you to do is do different. That's it. Like, and there won't be anything between us. And then he even warns him. He says, "And if you don't, like, then crouching outside your door," which there's a whole interpretive rabbit hole there. I won't go down, but I'm just going to
Yeah.
plant my flag and say, this is not a sin offering. This is a sin beast. This is
Mm-hmm.
a reference to, like, the Mesopotamian demon called a Rabisu. So it's the
Mm-hmm.
idea that, like, there's this demonic figure just waiting to crouch, to pounce, to devour. And anyone who's read Peter's epistles should be really familiar with that language. And and Adonai is saying, "Look, Cain, if you don't listen to me, if you don't hear my voice, just like he told his father Adam, here's what will happen: you will die the death because you will be
Yeah.
swallowed up by this creature that's ready to get you. And I stand ready to protect you. All I need is just for you to respond well." And of course, we know Cain doesn't.
Right.
And then the very next thing we would expect from a penal retributive God is, okay, here comes the banhammer. But actually, what we see is that Adonai protects Cain. He puts a mark on him, and the whole goal of that mark is to protect him. Cain says, "I you've cursed me." Like, the ground was cursed with Adam. Cain's was cursed from the ground. And so he says, my iniquity is too great for me to bear, which I don't think is really repentance. It's more of just like, dude. It's more, like that kind of,
Yeah.
it's more like the reaction of someone who finally got caught rather than
Yeah.
the reaction of true remorse. But still, God protects him and takes care of him and says, okay, I will give you a lifetime. He doesn't say this, but this is how I'm interpreting it. I will give you a lifetime to repent. Your whole life. I'll make sure you have a long life, and you have thousands of opportunities. And at every step of the way, I stand ready to forgive and receive you back. Of course, we know he never does, but that's on Cain, not on God, because of the way that God reacts to that.
And I love that two stories that a lot of times get used in ways that make us afraid of God, in some kind of cosmic Zeus coming to, drop the hammer on us the first time we mess up. That really what is happening, at least from what I'm seeing, is God, the first thing he does is responds to them in love and mercy. He cares for them first. And then in that loving care, in a way that is bigger than we can understand, does what is the most loving, best thing to help them come around and to get back to a place where they want to be in loving relationship with God again. Right. And so I think that it really is, even though it's a hard circumstance, it really does show us how much it goes into the heart of Hesed. And that word Hesed is that the first response is love and mercy. The first response isn't punishment. It isn't inflicting torment and pain and suffering. That's not what we see from page 3, page 4, the beginning.
Well, basically, at this point, you're citing the most quoted verse in the Old Testament, the Exodus 34, 6-7, where right after the golden calf incident, Moses goes up to Adonai and he says, maybe I can make atonement on behalf of the people. And curiously, he doesn't bring a bloody dead animal. He offers his own life. And Adonai says, no, I don't need that. I will accept your intercession and I will forgive the people. And then Moses gets bold and says, can I see your glory? Like, it seems like you're in a good mood or a giving mood. Like, can I have more? And I'm being a little flippant. And at that point, Adonai reveals his name again and his nature. And he says, the Lord, loving and, merciful and gracious, slow to anger, abounding in chesed and faithfulness. He delights in forgiving iniquity, transgression, and sin. And all three of those it's kind of like saying all the bad stuff, because those are like the three big like bad words in the Bible. And of course he goes on to say, like, I will not clear the guilty, which if we look at that purely from a penal perspective and say that God will not clear the guilty, if you sin, he's coming for you. He has to, or else he can't be just. Then it makes total nonsense of the verse of the line immediately preceding. What does it mean to be forced to punish sin and also to forgive sin? Right. Like, those two just do not work together. And so what he says, when he says, I will not clear the guilty, what he's saying is, if people persist in unrepentance, like Cain, continue to sin with a high hand, to use the term from Numbers, then they will bear their own iniquity. But Adonai stands ready at all times to bear their iniquity on their behalf. That's what the Hebrew word forgive iniquity means. It's nasa avon. It means like to put a burden on one's shoulders and to carry it off. Like, it's the same language that gets used for the goat for exile. in Leviticus 16. So Yahweh is saying, I want to do that for you. And I am long suffering and I will deal with a lot. And when we
Right.
follow the narrative of Israel throughout the scriptures, we do see that that's exactly what he does. He puts up with a lot.
He does. Yeah.
Yes. And eventually he does bring exile precisely because they refused to do anything that is going to be healthy for them, healthy for the poor and the oppressed in their midst, healthy for the land itself, because they are being so flagrantly not just violating the laws, but like destroying themselves and everyone around them. Because Adonai is somebody who jealously cares for and loves his good creation, and anything that defaces and distorts it, he's against. And of course, that often includes us who are sinful humans. And that's why he's long suffering.
Right.
But at the end of the day, if we refuse to admit that we have done wrong, then he will deal with that. But what's really key there is that the text of Exodus 34, 6-7 places the quote unquote good stuff in it to 1,000 generations, and the quote unquote bad stuff to only 3 or 4. So the percentage here is way out of whack. Because I think a lot of times people look at God and they think of him as being like, well, he wants to forgive and he wants to love us, but he's got this justice problem that gets in the way and he has to punish sin. So, but really what the text of scripture actually says is God's saying, actually, it's the other way around. It's my
Right.
mercy. It's my mercy that constrains my justice, or so to speak, that sense of have to punish, so to speak.
Yeah.
So yeah.
So I want to. Okay. So I'm going to skip ahead a little
Sorry,
bit.
I jumped way forward.
That's okay. That's okay. That's okay. Wait, this is gonna work. We're not like stuck to an actual line of following story through story here. We're kind of jumping around a little bit. I'm just kind of in my head going through some of the big hurtful things. So we're gonna jump to a big one and jump to Noah, because what do we do with God wiping out everybody except one family? That's a lot of innocent people that just died there. Children, the elderly, people who we don't know anything about these people, and God just unilaterally just kills almost everybody on the planet. And how is God loving if he just wipes out almost everyone who's still alive on the planet? That one I still I'm looking at it in the big, you step back to the 30,000 foot view, you can kind of see the theme of where that's going. But that is still, for me, is even a hard story, because all those, my compassionate, empathetic side is like all those poor women and children who didn't do anything. Like what do we do with the flood, Spencer?
Oh boy. Well, I did sign up for this, so yeah, I'm right in the middle of that part of Genesis right now in my walkthrough. And I just got done doing, actually, the last episode that is currently up right now is on that. It's called Through the Waters of Purification, because I'm wrestling with that exact question. And I say in there several times, like, if this makes you uncomfortable, you're not crazy. Like, it's kind of supposed to. And I think part of the reason why that discomfort is important is that what we see in the flood is God dealing with incredible, like really, really deep and horrific sin and wickedness. And that is not something that can be done with a surgeon and scalpel. That kind of has to be done with a much bigger thing. And so, like, which honestly, if you think about it in today's context, makes sense. So, if we think of the structures of oppression or things that cause hurt to people in today's, I'll just use a church, for example, a church that is very abusive, like a mega church, for example. We've seen what happens when they fall, when they get washed away in a flood. A lot of people lose their jobs. A lot of people lose their livelihoods. A lot of people are left questioning and wondering why. A lot of people are swept up and caught up in that deluge. And it does raise a lot of questions that are legitimate and normal. But I also think that that is also very real. That the picture we see in Genesis 6 through 9 is very much what we would expect out of our experience of dealing with big structures of violence and death. And that's kind of the big picture that I want to lay out, and that I did lay out in my podcast, is that Genesis 6 and the flood is a response to the evil and the wickedness of the Nephilim, of these kind of like demonized humans that are running the earth and in charge. Like, they're not just there, they're the ones calling the shots. They are the ones ruling the cities. And the way that, like, when we look at things like First Enoch and some other intertestamental and Second Temple texts, we see that gets played out in like really ugly ways, with like cannibalism and child sacrifice and stuff like that. And so when you're asking the question about like these poor women and these poor children, I look at this and I say, if we take the text seriously as what it's depicting, this is a society that is ruled by essentially like serial killers, Ted Bundy, people like that, but they live for 600 years and they are in absolute power, and every single facet of society reflects their image, not God. That is a horrifying prospect. And that is something that a good God could not sit by and watch. And I think that's what he says. He says, the end of all flesh has come up before me, which is not him saying, oh, they're being naughty, I gotta take them out. That's what we see in the Mesopotamian flood myths, is that the humans are just dancing around and making too much noise, and the gods say, yeah, squish those bugs. But that's not what we see in Genesis, where actually the response of Adonai to the sin of humans is grief. It says that God was grieved in his heart that he had made humans. And so that's a really, really important thing to keep in mind, is that our sin grieves God first and foremost. And so and the way that he decides to handle that is with a flood of purification that washes away the blood of the innocent, calling out from the ground, crying out for justice. And he says, okay, I'm going to take the whole thing out. And now, along with that, I would also add another tradition that we do see both outside the scripture and inside the scripture itself in 2 Peter, where it talks about Noah as a preacher of righteousness. So the idea there is that when in 6:3, I think it is, when God says, my spirit will no longer contend with man, his years will be 120. the idea there is that Noah, for 120 years, went around telling people, hey, look, the end is near. Like, essentially telling them, get out now. Get out while you still can. And I don't know exactly if that is something that we can read as saying people did listen and people were saved from that, because I am an advocate of a local flood for whatever that's worth. But yeah, there's an awful lot of really complex things in there. And bottom line, and that I would say, is that when we look at the text, what we see is that God lets it go for a very long time, not just lets it go, but like gives an opportunity for it to get better for a very long time. He gives a prophetic word that says, please stop. And when he finally makes the call, it's because the end has already happened. The end has come up before him. And at this point, it's inevitable. And he just says, okay, I'm going to pull the plug on this and let the chaos waters rush back in and uncreate so that he can recreate. And it is very significant that when he does that, he promises, I will never do that again.
One of the things I really appreciated after listening, because I listened to that episode. I think I've listened to almost all of them on your podcast now. I've gone back and I think I've gotten all
Gold
caught
star.
up now. And I absolutely love the way that you're approaching and going through. It gives me a lot of things to think about too, as I'm doing the things that I'm doing in the canonical narrative and thinking about some of these pieces in the way that gets read. But if we look at the flood, it occurred to me, at your podcast and then just listening to you now, like if you step back and remember Genesis, 1 and 2, the whole Adam and Eve and Cain and Abel, and God's first response is mercy and releasing them from the consequence of eternal sin and living in that. I can't imagine living in that memory of your sin forever and how that would haunt you. And if you're living in the context of that, where you've got the Nephilim, you've got this horrible environment, that if that part of that wasn't the mercy of releasing the innocent from a terrible existence, that, because I think sometimes in our context now, we have a hard time not being afraid of death, and sometimes extending life into at all costs, because we're afraid of death. And sometimes we don't always see that death is a mercy of releasing us from things that are painful, they're suffering, that sometimes, if we end looking at it that way, really has kind of helped me as I've been rethinking that flood narrative and a lot of the terrible things that are in the Old Testament, that seeing that as the mercy of someone who grows up in a context of violence, where you're violated and there's just all kinds of horrible things going on, like that is again God's chesed and his love and mercy to take you out and spare you from a life of horrible violence and all kinds of things. Like that has kind of helped me as I'm working on trying to get my head around that, the Noah and the flood narrative.
Yeah, it really is. It is so ugly on all sides. And I think, like, for me, the biggest takeaway that I walk away from that is this is what sin is. This is what sin does. And I really think, and while I don't want to do a cheap juke and say, oh, well, really, let's look at the sin, not look at God. I mean, I think we should look at both. But I think very often a lot of that questioning process, or not questioning, that aggressive challenge that sometimes can come out of that, dismisses the context, dismisses the real reason of what's there, is that sin is gross. And this is not just God going, ew, I don't like that.
Mhm.
It's him looking at a whole culture that is saturated in depravity and like the worst kind of wickedness you can possibly imagine, and filled with vulnerable people, women, children, the infirm, um, uh, anybody like that. And how would they be treated in that space? And what would life be like for them? And I mean,
Mhm.
I thank God himself that I don't have to make that call. And I think that's really the ultimate kind of place where I land, is that when God talks about forgiving iniquity, he talks about
Mhm.
him bearing the burden. And of course, we see the ultimate picture of that in Christ, who bore our sins in his body on the tree, where he let humanity and the dark powers do all that stuff to him.
Mhm.
Um, and ultimately, what we have is a picture of a God who takes on the worst that humanity has and says, I am willing to take it into myself so that it will be get healed and I can give you back life. And
Yeah.
that's really the ultimate frame that we have to have around the flood, because it is part of the text.
I want to kind of jump. We're going to jump to a bit more of a thematic, not exactly to one particular story, but I want to jump into a thematic thing that we see in the rest of the Pentateuch specifically.
Mm-hmm.
But we see things like, you've got, I can't remember the guy's name off the top of my head, but there as well, I guess this is later. We'll save that one for a little bit. But as you see things going on in the old, in there, you've got people who mess up, and the sons of Korah, the earth opens up and they get swallowed, and an entire family, because of one, one or two or three people in that family.
Mm-hmm.
You get you just see these bigger themes, and you get into the book of like Joshua, and you get the conquest of Israel into the promised land, and that looks like genocide. Like there's some really difficult
Yes.
like, how do we deal with this, grappling with these ideas, and this, if God is supposed to be loving, and I think one of the things that helped me understand it when I went through Torah class with the woman that I had, she's a Deuteronomy scholar, and listening to her talking about this was really fascinating, because
Mm-hmm.
we see this thing in Torah a lot with like the clean and the unclean, and the
Mm-hmm.
process of that is for people are pulled out from the community, so they are cast, they're separated out, but usually when that happens, there's always the intention for them to be brought back in. So whatever the disease that they have will be cured, the hard-heartedness that they have will be, softened,
Mm-hmm.
the offense that they've committed will have to be made right, but they will always, the intention is to always be restored. They would be redeemed back into the community. But there are
Yep.
things that we see, and offenses that that happen, that make them unable to be brought back into the community. There is a certain line where God says, if we bring that back in, it will poison the community as a whole.
Right.
And
Yep.
our context doesn't understand that, because in our Western, we are so individualized that we
Yes.
don't
We don't get
understand this,
community.
like,
Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
But to separate out one for the preservation of the whole is a concept we have a really hard time with. But I think that's really important to understand this idea that sometimes one is separated out for the preservation of the whole, but also with the intention to bring them back in. So can you talk about that a little bit, and why
Yeah.
that's so important for the rest of what we get through in the Old
Whew.
Testament?
Well, I think that actually the quarantine model is a really good one to have in mind here, where
Mhm.
there's somebody who is patient zero. Like, again, looking at sin in this like we've talked about from the very beginning, not as rule breaking per se, but as a disease, an illness,
Mhm.
a defect of some kind. And there's some person who, now keep in mind, this is not like they did something tiny and small. This is like sitting with a high hand, um,
Yeah.
doing any of the list of uh, sexual immoralities that are listed in places like Leviticus 18, or people who are drinking blood, for example, which is very much like a ritual cannibalism in the pagan sacrificial context. And so these are people who are doing something that they have contracted the disease, and this is a highly contagious disease. And so what God sets up for Israel is, I want you to be different from the other nations. And so what I want you to do is, when people in your community contract the disease on various layers and levels, separate them. That may look like full-on excommunication. It may look like a death sentence in certain cases. Or it may look like just a period of purification. There's a whole different spectrum there. When that happens, separate them so that they can then re-enter, and the whole community will not be infected by that. And I know, again, it's so hard as I talk about this to avoid coming at it from a purely moralistic standpoint. Like, wait
Mhm.
a minute, you mean like somebody who has to be separated because of their purification ritual is now an infection danger for the community? And then we immediately jump to like the moral sense of that, of like, oh, that means that they're dirty in a
Yeah.
moral sense. It's like, no, there's a distinction between ritual impurity and moral impurity. And those are handled differently. They have different remedies, and they have different consequences. And this is far too deep of a subject. This is my jam, but it's far too deep and
Right.
complex of a subject to really dive into here. But I would just say that it's really critical that when we look at, like, well, why do women who are menstruating have to separate themselves? Why does sex make one impure? Why does, all these things that are ordinary, normal, God-given in many cases? And it's really critical that we highlight that just because someone is ritually impure does not mean they have sinned. Now,
Mhm.
there are cases where there is no sacrifice and they have to be cut off, is the Hebrew word there, or
Mhm.
is the translation of the Hebrew word there. In those cases, yes, those are severe, serious cases, but that is, again, this like quarantining and removal process
Mhm.
to keep the community not just like pure, like, ew, I can't stand this stuff,
Mhm.
but pure in this sense of like, if this gets in there, it will kill babies, it will kill
Mhm.
innocent women and children, it will destroy God's good and beautiful Eden from the inside out. So
Yeah, it's about that loving care and God's mercy to spare like a plague from breaking out
mhm.
in damaging the whole body. So yeah, that was a hard one when I was trying to get my head around that in Torah class, because we're going to get, we get into moving forward into Joshua and what looks like genocide. Like, how can God go and order Israel to go kill everyone that lives there? Like,
Mhm.
how is God loving? But there's a couple of things that I kind of want to point out from the bigger picture, like what I see going on there, and then hear your thoughts on if I'm right or not, like not right or not, but
Yeah.
if I'm looking at this
I'll give my
from
opinion,
like,
but that's it.
yeah,
Not my judgment.
well, yeah, we try not to do that around here at all anyway. But but I wonder, there's a couple things with the Joshua story that one, I think you've got there Ishmael and Esau, when they are not the chosen firstborn. They're the firstborn, but they're not the one God chooses. But when he removes them from that part of the story, he still gives them a blessing.
Yes.
He doesn't just cast them out with nothing. He gives them a blessing. He gives them protection. He gives
Abraham
them
does.
land. And
Yeah.
well,
Yeah.
Abraham's a whole nother episode. Just Abraham himself.
Yes.
That family, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, that's a whole single episode by itself. But when he sends both of those firstborns who are passed over, but eventually they get to those two, the line of Ishmael and the line of Esau, get to the promised land first, and part of the blessing is to prepare the place for when Israel gets there, because the promise is given, you will walk into a place that is already prepared for you. And like we talked about at Biblical Rogues Gallery a couple weeks ago, olive trees that are ready for harvest. Olive trees take a very long time to cultivate, to grow, to be ready to actually give olives for people to eat them. Like, they're supposed to have houses they can live in already. Like, you're going to walk into a ready set up, you buy a fully furnished house. This is what's like the picture that's being created there. And somebody has to do that work. But what was supposed to happen is, again, Ishmael and Esau were sent out to prepare, but they were supposed to be brought right back in, because they are still children of Abraham. They're still part of that family. But siblings doing what siblings do, they were not brought back in like they were supposed to be. So, people see that. And the other thing, I think, understanding the dynamics of the Elohim, the little g God situation that's going on there, and how deity is tied to the land. And the people in those cultures there, with their relationship to their deity, they've heard the story of the Exodus. They've heard the stories of what happened there. They understand in their context what the implications of that are. And they see Israel coming with Yahweh at the front, with the great big cloud and the pillar of fire, and just this visible presence of this God who is, bigger, with bigger dominion and sovereignty than any other deity in their land. And I think they understood Yahweh better than Israel did. And a lot of them, we see pictures of them, they were either fleeing or they were absorbed into the community in different ways. And so it isn't as we portrayed when I was growing up, this picture of mass genocide and everyone is wiped out. There's really only 3 battles recorded in the book of Joshua. And all of those have extreme significance in cosmic geography. They're places of really big importance. And so those places had to be conquered. But most of the intention was that they would be pulled back in, or they were flee before, so that they weren't wiped out. God wasn't trying to just, again, with the flood, kill everyone who was there before. So Spencer, how close are we getting
Oh, no, this is really good. Because there's 2 things I want to highlight. One is, what you were talking about sounds an awful lot like what is described in Deuteronomy 2, where the Israelites are coming through the land, or coming into the land, and they come to the territory of the descendants of Esau. And God says, and I want to make sure I get it right, so I'm going to actually read a small portion here. He says, Do not meddle with them, for I will not give you any of their land, no, not so much as one footstep, because I have given Mount Seir to Esau as a possession. And then later on, he talks about how he helped them destroy the Horites, which is a giant clan that was in the land before that. And so there's like, this is not the story of the Hebrew Bible is not the story of God choosing only one country or one nation and then only working with that ethnic group. And it's not even really about ethnicity at all, which I will stick a pin in and come back to later. But it's not the story of him dealing with one like special ethnic group and then saying everybody else is going to get wiped out. It's him saying from the beginning, I want to use these people to be the means through which the whole world comes back to me. And of course, there's a whole background narrative there of like the dispersal of the nations at Babel and the assignation of them to various other Elohim and all those things that I won't get into. But anyway, all that to say that that is definitely I resonate a lot with that idea of Esau in that I mean, well, first of all, Esau himself is reconciled with Jacob. That's how his story ends. And finally, that, his descendants are gifted land by God as part of the promise. So yeah, it very much is not like you're in or you're out. It's there's a lot more to that. Now, as far as like God not, trying to use the Israelites to wipe out, engage in an ethnic cleansing. Again, this is not about ethnicity. This is more about like a people who share a way of life, more or less. So one of the ways that I've heard it said by Father Stephen DeYoung, he's the host of the Lord of Spirits podcast, and he's written a whole book about this called God is a Man of War. So it's a good one. I would recommend it. But he says that if so as the people go into the land, first thing is they're only supposed to do defensive responses. They're not supposed to go on the offense and go out and get people. And then if they encounter a city, the first thing they're supposed to do is offer terms to them, offer mercy, clemency. And any who agree to that, any who say, yes, I want to not be a part of this culture, they become Israelites. They stop being Amalekites or Hivites or whoever, Perizzites or whoever they are. They stop being that. And that's why we see people like Rahab. That happens in the story of Jericho. Sorry, I don't know why my brain stopped working there.
Okay.
Yeah. We also see that in that Caleb himself, one of the two faithful spies who goes into the promised land, was a Canaanite, was a member of one of the non-ethnically Israelite peoples, and he became a leader of the tribe of Judah. So all of these things, like this is not about God likes one set of DNA and everything else is yucky to him and he wants to erase it. It's more like God saying, these are the people that I have set aside to heal my world. And I'm going to use them as the instrument of my purification and cleansing and healing. Now, there's a lot of wickedness out here. And rather than just immediately going, you're gone, I'm going to give them a chance to repent. I'm going to give them every chance to join my people and not just like be saved from death, but be saved from, I mean, like the kind of life in those cities must have been awful. I mean, just horrific. Like this is a group of people who, like, especially when you compare like the Code of Hammurabi and the other kind of ancient Near East ways of living with the Israelite way of living,
Mhm.
they're night and day apart. And I just got a
Mhm.
really good recommendation for a book that I'm going to read about that, to kind of get more details. But I can't really give a whole lot right now, other than I just I do know that I've seen enough already to know that that is true. That the laws of the Torah
Mhm.
were, as much as they might make us cringe in certain spaces, they were leaps and bounds and worlds
Mhm.
ahead of everything else around them. And so when Joshua comes to a city and says, "Join us," he's saying,
Mhm.
"Leave, leave the demons. Like they,
Right.
life with them sucks.
Mhm.
Leave the demons. Come over to Yahweh, and He will protect you from them." It's not saying everybody's gonna die. So,
Right. I think that, but if you have this, you start with the view that God is a form of a mega Zeus with a big hammer waiting to smash you every time you make a mistake, then it's really easy to get to that point when you get to Joshua, and you don't see this, that first they're offered the chance to join Israel. They're offered the chance to be brought into the family. Like, God is the biggest advocate of adoption that there is. I mean, he is every single person. Come back, rejoin the family. I will readopt you into the family. So all of these people that have been scattered through all these people groups, that's his original intention. He makes it very clear with Abraham.
yes.
And like, it's like, Abraham, I'm going to make you guys the deliverers of the message that I want to adopt all of you back into the family. And that really
Mhm.
helped me when I was listening to Dr. Jossberger talking about this whole idea that's what's going on. The family are the ambassadors with the message. You're offered readoption into the family. Accept that blessing, accept that name, accept that inheritance, accept that hesed, that love to come back to the family that I want to reconcile. And that really changed a lot of how I looked at some of those things.
Mhm.
So we're going to jump again, another big jump, because I really want to make sure we get to my favorite stuff.
Oh
And
boy.
I know, I know, I'm thinking thematically here. So, because that's kind of the way I look at it. But we're going to catapult over some of that stuff, and we're going to go to the prophets, because the
There
latter
you go.
prophets, I
Mhm.
love the latter prophets, but there is some stuff
Woof.
in there. Really, really rough
Yes.
stuff.
Yes.
And I think for me, I think for me, the two best places to see that is Ezekiel and Lamentations, which Lamentations
Mhm.
is technically actually in the Ketuvim, but not in the
Mhm.
Nevi'im. But anyway, so Jeremiah and Ezekiel are the two who really, really pull out a lot of the grit and the yuck. It's all
Mhm.
over in a lot of it. And yes, as several people have noticed, Ezekiel's my favorite book. And it didn't start that way. I've always loved
Yeah.
Habakkuk in that dialogue back and
Oh,
forth. Oh, that's a
Hosea.
beautiful book.
That's mine.
And Hosea.
Hosea. Although
Good
I'm
stuff.
growing to love Zechariah.
Mm. When I was in prophets class, I had this guy actually changed the trajectory of everything for me. But I was like, when we were looking through the syllabus, I'm like, which week is Ezekiel? Because I'll be somewhere else that week. Because that's a weird book, and I don't even want to forget it. I don't even want to, because there's weirdness going on all over the place in Ezekiel.
Yep. Oh
And
yes.
16 through 24 talk about, I mean, some of that Hebrew in there, Spencer, is pornographic. I mean, it just
Yes. Yes.
downright
Yeah. Yeah.
pornography.
Yeah.
So
It
wow, I couldn't
is.
believe it. We had in that prophets
Yes.
class that I had, all of us were Hebrew students in there, and so he took full advantage of the fact that we all knew Hebrew and really got into that. But as we were going through and talking about first looking at Jeremiah, who's sitting in the middle of everything that's happening, and Ezekiel, who's been deported, watching it from afar. You're getting a stereo view of the fall of Israel and what happens at the destruction of the temple and the casting out into the exile.
Yeah.
But if you look at that, it's just like, they're talking about God is intentionally, first he brings the Assyrians and the northern tribes are wiped out. Then we never see them again. They're gone. And
until
then
the fullness of the Gentiles comes in. But yes.
right.
Yes.
Yeah. But then you're like, how is that even a thing? And then the Assyrians get in trouble for going too far because they weren't supposed to do that. And you get the Babylonians, and you get the conversation with Habakkuk makes so much more sense. It's like, how can you tolerate all of this? And he uses the Babylonians to not only correct Assyria for going too far with the north, but also to bring around and cast Judah out of the land, because the land, Judah, and one of the things that, if you don't understand, like how in Torah works, a lot of the sexual sin and a lot of just the level of perversion that was going on. I mean, just reading in Ezekiel what's happening in the temple itself is absolutely shocking. They're bowing to other gods, mooning the Ark of the Covenant. Like, they're literally just, it's gritty and gross and disgusting, and it's amazing that God put up with that for so long. And you see that in that language. God is just grieving for how he is, but eventually God has to cast them out. The land needs cleansed because the land itself is saturated with evil, with pain and grief, and it's just, the land needed a break. And so Israel had to go because it just, the level, but so Spencer, let's just kind of dig into this a little bit. How is it that God, who's supposed to love Israel, destroys the northern tribes completely, and we never see them again until later? We're not even there yet when that whole reconciliation isn't fully done. And Israel, Judah loses everything. The temple and God's presence is gone and destroyed. Everything that makes them who they are is taken away and destroyed, and people are living in genocide. I mean, listen, it's just genocide, slavery, deportation, everything we have now as our checklist of evil, God does to Israel and Judah. And what do we do with that?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the question you're asking is the question that occupied, Lamentations, like you said, as well as the whole intertestamental period. That's why we got so many like apocalyptic works in that time, because they're all looking around at the nature of God's chosen people, quote unquote, and they're saying, where is he? Like, and by all accounts, we don't have like a theophanic glory cloud that descends in the temple with the rebuilding of the second temple. And so they're also wondering that as well. And even after it gets cleansed from the in the Maccabees, we still don't see the glory cloud come down, kind of thing. And so it's this just existential angst of, what do we do? Like, we're moving along like Yahweh is still on our side, but we've been taken over by Persia, because you talked about Babylon being used to correct Assyria. Well, Persia was used to correct Babylon, because God says the exact same thing in Isaiah 43 about Babylon. It says, like, you made your yoke really heavy on the aged. Like, what is wrong with you? And so, and then of course from there we get the the Greeks with
Mhm.
Alexander of Macedon, and then we get the Ptolemaic Empire of Egypt, and then we get the Romans, and
Mhm.
I'm probably missing somebody in there somewhere. But anyway, the point is, been a whole parade of
Yep.
pagan foreign enemies taking over um, Judea. And the question you're asking is exactly the one that Paul wrestles with in Romans, especially
Right.
9 through 11,
Yep.
is saying, is God unfaithful to his promises? Because, uh, yeah. So, um, I think, well, one of the reasons why I like Hosea so much is because of that language of, you can really hear God's heart bleeding out of Hosea.
Mhm.
Um, like in Hosea 6, where he says, "O Ephraim," which is the shorthand for the northern kingdom, "O Ephraim, what shall I do to you? O Judah, what shall I do to you?" Or like when he says that Ephraim has mixed himself among the people. Ephraim is like a cake unturned. So he says, like, look, I set you apart, but you've just mixed yourself back in. And I don't know what to do with you. But then he also says, how can I give you up? Like, there's
Mhm.
how can I hand you over, Israel? How can I make you like Admah, and how can I set you like Zeboim? My heart churns within me. My sympathy, which means my bowels, like my womb, actually is
Mhm.
stirred. Um, so yeah, there's in all of those pictures of exile that we see in the prophets, in the really grotesque images that God and the prophets paint of what Israel and Judah both are doing, which, by the way, is can almost not be painted too bleakly. Like if you look
Mhm.
up Molech and child sacrifices, it's despicable, and I don't recommend
Mhm.
anyone doing it. But that's what they did, and again, I go back to we have a real problem with the wrath of God, but
Mhm.
ultimately, to me, I've actually found, I don't think I quite say comfort, but
Mhm.
peace in the wrath and understanding the wrath of God, because it really is ultimately the response of God to the innocent and the vulnerable being crushed and
Mhm.
hurt and oppressed. And if God doesn't hate that and respond with really intense ways to stop that, then I have a hard time seeing how he's loving at all. And I think that's what the picture the prophets paint of Israel is exactly that, and saying, look, you are just like these nations now, that God set you apart and you were supposed to, and that was the whole point of the conquest, was to eradicate all those practices of Moloch worship and Baal worship and Ashtoreth worship and all the other stuff. And they didn't. They failed. And the result of that was that they have that the cancer is
Mhm.
taking root deep in the community. And then it slowly metastasizes until we see the kingdom split. And then the northern kingdom had 0 good kings, not a one.
Yeah. Not a one.
And they all were just wicked, and so that's why they went away first. But again, God is long suffering and dealt with them for a very, very long time, and he still
Mhm.
says, how can I give you up? You are my people. I can't give you up. My heart is churned within me. And
Yep.
then he did us the same finally for Judah, and then brings back a remnant. So, and the whole purpose of that is to rebuild, to restore,
Mhm.
to use the remnant as the shoot coming out of the stump, which is a very Isaiah image, to be able to use that to grow a new, okay, not
Mhm.
new, renewed tree, a healed, healthy,
Mhm.
uh, having a tree that has had the cancer cut out. Yes, with an axe at the root,
Mhm.
but which is also an image that Jesus uses. So this is rough justice. This is really, really, really tough love. But it is still, if we look at the entirety of the prophetic corpus and the scriptures and the final fulfillment of all that in Christ, it is still love, without a doubt.
Mhm. But I think too, one of the other things that I learned that I absolutely adored from my prophets professor, and we talked about a lot. If you go and just look at Isaiah through Malachi and how many times we see the word shuv,
Oh, yes.
which is
Yes.
turn, return, depending on which form of that word it is. You can't go 6 words without tripping over this word. I mean, it is everywhere, 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 everywhere. And God is desperately sending prophet after prophet after prophet. All of them, every single prophet in there is screaming return. They're screaming shuv at the people over and over and over. And it's like you said, like that whole rebellion, that whole choice to not follow Yahweh has so tainted and hardened their hearts that they choose, and eventually they have to be put out, because sometimes we have to have a drastic disruption to shake us awake, to bring us around to change, because like you said, that it just the stuff that was going on, and going back and looking at God's mercy, would you get to the point where you are so like the other nations? And Ezekiel gets so graphic with this, but they are sacrificing their own children. They are just the depravity, with Noah going back, it's a reflection of what we see in Noah. It was so bad that to live in that culture was a mercy to put them out. It was a mercy for them to be corrected. That we don't like it when we were forced to make a change, because we are so in. But as we are dealing with people in our lives and situations and struggles, we all think about those people in our lives and our, however we know them, who we can see they're on the road to no good. We can see that they're headed for a crash because of whatever their thing is. It's, growing up with, I have a sibling who is an alcoholic addict, and you could just see that coming, and the damage that it would do, and the damage that it did. And it took an intervention. And sometimes you have to let them get to that point where they hit that rock bottom, and put them out, and to bring them back. But it goes back to Torah again. They had to be put out so that they could be put into a heart place where they were ready to be brought back in. God put them out in exile to bring them back in return. The interesting thing too, and Spencer, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, because you get them coming back, but Ezra and Nehemiah, which is a hard book in and of itself.
Oh yeah.
But it's but then you get there, you're reading Ezra and Nehemiah, and they're like, okay, we're going back to the promise, we're going back to the land, we're going back to the covenant. So we're going to go back to, we can figure out what we did wrong, so we can do it right this time. And they get there, and they don't even start off right, because they didn't build the temple first like they were supposed to. There's a whole lot of things that they did wrong, but they're looking around like, God, where are you? This is not what we thought we would come back to. Like, this is not what you promised us when we returned to the land. What happened? Why did God fail when they came back and it wasn't what they were expected, what they thought they were being promised? Is God lying to us? Did God set us up to fail? Like, what is happening in this whole idea?
Right. Yeah, I try to put myself in the shoes of those people, and that just boggles my mind that they got sent off into exile. They lived in the middle of a pagan nation, which, by the way, would have incurred a ton of impurity and compromise and hard choices and all those things. And then they get sent back, and I'm sure they were like delighted and dancing. And I believe that's actually pictured in Ezra Nehemiah, like them like blowing trumpets as they come in. But then it's this ruin, and they're like, we came back for this. We were so excited about this. And it's like just the disappointment and the depression that would hit in that moment. And I actually think that's a really good analogy for what a lot of people experience in their relationship with God is they feel like they've been in a space of hitting rock bottom. And then they try to work their way back and get back into what they hope will be a normal life, what they hope will just be what they're longing for, what they're expecting. But then when they get there, it just doesn't feel right. It doesn't feel like what they expect. It doesn't feel like what they hope for, what they long for. It's like, really, this is the way it's supposed to be? Is this all it's ever going to be? Like, why did I even do all that work? And that's real. And that's one of the reasons to me why I think the Hebrew Bible and the whole scriptures as a whole is so trustworthy, is because it is so real to real life. Like, it is not a hagiography. I hate those approaches to the Bible that say, here's all the heroic stories of people we should emulate. It's like, no, let's not emulate Samson. Bad idea. Let's and for that matter, let's not emulate David. That's also, I mean, there are ways in which we should, but there's a lot of ways in which we shouldn't. I mean, God himself said, you can't build my temple.
Right.
You have crossed the line too many times. So like, there's so much realness and rawness in the way that the Bible talks about the human condition. And that to me is proof of its inspiration and truth more than any kind of like, you know, any kind of Westhoff argument. It's definitely going to be, to me, that's the way I look at that stuff in Ezra, Nehemiah. But that's just what comes to me off the top of my head. But I'd love to hear some more of your thoughts on that.
Yeah, we just kind of briefly chatted before we started this whole idea, and I think the thing that really has spoken to me as I've done a lot of work wrestling through the prophets, especially, and just following that whole thing, and in canonical narrative, when you read Chronicles last, and the thing that blew me away when I did that was how much Chronicles focuses on worship. And it's all about the worship of God. They get back to the land worshiping God. Like it's all over the place. And sitting back and looking at that and thinking about this whole thing and being like, if this is this whole story is bookended with worship at the beginning, and it's created in blessing and worship, and it's bookended at the other end in the Hebrew Bible. You've got worship starts and ends the story. And that takes it to a place where I think I walk away thematically in a big 30,000 foot view of the Hebrew Bible, of God is in his hesed, in his love and his long suffering for us. He's not afraid to be honest about all of it. He's not afraid to be honest about the pain, the damage that we inflict upon each other. And that sometimes, as this loving God who is, in so much more sovereign and knowing than we have any context to understand, wants to dialogue with us about this ugliness, about the hard things, wants to be upfront and honest and say, I want to invite you to talk to me about your pain. Bring me your pain because I am honest first. And to put out that level of, I think God's saying, you can trust me because I'm being honest with you first.
Mm-hmm.
And that goes a long way to understanding the dialogue God wants to have, which takes me back to Habakkuk. And that back and forth there, Habakkuk is saying, God, why is this so horrible? And God is like,
Yeah.
just trust me. Just watch. I will prove myself to you. Just watch what I'm about to do. And that to me really kind of sums up the back and forth dialogue that's happening there between a God who loves us but is not afraid to be honest.
Yes.
And that we can see that is played out. And we get to when Christ comes on the scene, he takes that dialogue and he lives it out. He demonstrates it on earth so people can touch it, they can interact with it. And it is a very real way of saying this chesed that you have interacted with in an invisible way. I'm going to bring it down and show it to you in person and live out that hesed, live out that honesty, because Christ does the exact same thing that we see played out there. To be honest, he's honest with people in their pain. He's honest with people in their, he takes no prisoners with the Pharisees. Why? Because they are a cancer that's infecting the community.
Yes.
And he is caring for the community. And he has to get rid of that. But he is, Jesus never turns away an honest seeker. Never. He always shows them love and mercy. And when you also think about Isaiah brings in the idea that salvation has healing with it. So Christ lives that out, because half the time, what does he say to people when he interacts with them? When the sick and the infirmed are brought to Jesus, what does he say? Your sins are forgiven. Well, if you miss that, Isaiah is saying salvation is healing. So there's this whole thing of God is saying, I want to restore you and heal you. Like there is this very much, again, you just can't get away from the word hesed. It is everywhere. That is the message. It is who God is. So it's just, it just blows me away that God says, talk to me. I want to be honest because I'm going to be honest first. And Spencer, what does that do for us who come from trauma backgrounds when God puts his cards on the table first, and we see that he does that?
Oh, I'm so glad that you asked that question. Because one of the things that trauma does is it wires us for protection instead of connection. And so all of our sensory apparatus and all of our threat detection systems are hyper vigilant. They are uber responsive to the slightest association or the slightest indication. And so the reason why that's so critical that God gets down on our level, literally in the incarnation, but also in the prophets as well. The reason why that's so significant is because that's what healing from that protective instinct of trauma looks like, is when the person with the power can lay down the power and say, I'm not going to use this against you. I am setting it down. And instead I'm holding my hands open wide for you to come in and to show you that I've got nothing in my hands that's going to hurt you. Like that's how Isaiah 40 starts, like the whole section, the whole second section of Isaiah that was written probably after the exile starts off with Adonai saying, comfort my people, because her sins are forgiven. Her iniquity is dealt with. And now it's time for streams of refreshing. And so all of those things are like, that's what the picture of Adonai in the scriptures is him holding his hands out wide, open, to us. And I'm tempted to make a cross reference here, but I'm just going to let it hang there.
Right.
And boy, that was a pun, not intended.
Right.
Anyway, and he says, come on in. I am not against you. I am for you. I am, I know to go to Jeremiah, I know the plans I have for you, plans to give you a hope and a future. And that's the hesed that he has for all of us. And that's definitely what we see in, even in the moments where he sends Israel or Judah off into exile. Because the whole purpose of that is, I want to get rid of the cancer. I want to cleanse everything. Like, and that's why we see in Deuteronomy and other places throughout the Bible where it talks about God as a consuming fire. Like that's what his presence does. And I think sometimes a lot of times we kind of like, we have to be careful what we wish for. Like, yeah, well, like, why can't God just show up? Well, because that's dangerous when we're not in the right place. And that's, and what we see in the story of Israel is that God said, okay, all of this pollution that you're causing on the land, in my temple, in all these things, if I stay here, there won't be anything left. So it's an act of mercy for me to go to Ezekiel, pack up the chariot throne and
Right.
and go off. And that will mean that the chaos waters of the pagan nations will rush in and they will do enormous damage. There will be a deluge of purification that will wash over the whole land, the whole earth, so to speak. And that's necessary to be able to take care of the depth of depravity that you have sunk to. But I will not leave myself without a remnant. There will always be somebody who I will hold back and make sure that they can be the seed that grows into the tree that I always designed you to be. And that's really what, God's heart is really all about, is that even though trauma causes immense hurt and immense harm, and yes, sometimes there are times where we can even say in the biblical text, at least, that it came from God's hand. It is always something that he is designing for our good, and because he loves us, because of his hesed that he has for us. That's really, really hard to see sometimes. And it's not crazy, because the Bible has ample evidence of that, of people saying, how long, O Lord? Where are you? The wicked are winning.
Right.
So,
I just can't get past this whole open hands. I'm going to put my power down and open up my hands to you. I mean, because if you
yes.
come from a place of violence, or if you come from a place of where you have been, you have a lot of church hurt, and that is not what you come out of. And when you can step back and see, look, no, God is not, this is not Thor and his hammer. God
Yeah.
puts that down. He can do that if he needs to, but that's not ever where I think God wants to be. I think God sometimes has to pick that up when it's absolutely necessary, and there's no other, when we have left no other option. But to, just that image for me of, to put that down, come to you with that open-handed, like almost like in my head, you're just like that. You see in movies, like people put their weapons down and they put like their hands up, like, look, I'm not dangerous. It's
Right.
okay. You can come and approach me. Like, boy, Spencer, going back and thinking through reading the Hebrew Bible with this idea of God putting that down and coming to us with his hands up and open. Look, I'm vulnerable. I'm approachable. I want you
Yeah.
to come to me. Look, I'm not dangerous. What could that do to repair a lot of that damage that's been done to people? That just blows me away.
Yeah. Well, because of that hypervigilance and um, wiring for protection, when someone does that, first of all, it's usually not trusted. It's like, where's the angle?
Mhm,
There's
mhm,
something hidden somewhere. Life has taught me it's not safe to trust. And so I'm always looking for more. And
mhm,
and that's why God keeps holding his hands out and saying, "Okay, come in close. Put your finger in my side.
mhm,
See see the wounds and see that I'm real." And lets us come close and lets us yell at him and lets us hurt him, beat him, whip him, spit on him. And all those times, and that's why I love that image of Nasa Avon,
mhm,
of carrying the iniquity. That's what it means for God to bear our burdens, to bear our sins, to carry our iniquity, is him holding his hands open and saying, I don't care what you do to me because I can take it. I'm big
mhm,
enough. I'm strong enough. I'm all powerful. I can take it. Come near, do whatever you need to do to feel safe again, to convince yourself that I am for you, not against you. And
mhm.
once that happens, then there's finally an opening for connection and trust. And that's when God says, okay, that I can work with. That heart, that's all I want.
Yeah, I think that is the lesson from the prophets. Like, all God wants is for you to have you just have to respond. You don't have to do anything. God doesn't require us to do anything except, I think, in that whatever that makes us in our person, in heart, in spirit, however you want to put words on that to make it make sense. Like that crying out in God's direction, that's all God's wanting. That's all he was saying with the prophets to Israel. Just turn your heart
Yes.
in my direction. That's
Yes.
all I'm asking you to do.
Yes.
And even they couldn't even get that far, which
Mhm.
I mean, in some places it amazes me and sometimes it doesn't, because we all get stupidly stubborn like that sometimes in
Yep.
things. But just that picture of how, I don't want to say, because I don't want to like misspeak or anything at all, but it's so simple. It really
Mhm.
is. That God, all God asks of us is simple.
Yep.
And the damage, I think, um, that I hear from a lot of the content that I've listened to on your channel is the damage that happens is when we overspeak the simplicity of God and how that hurts each other.
Yeah. Yeah. Very much. One thought that I had about like the power of that hands open
Mhm,
idea, and this is in a very human to human way. So
mhm,
in my counseling practice, I also do marriage and family therapy. And I see a lot of couples come in where they come in and their arms are crossed,
mhm,
they're turned away from each other, their voices sound all like this toward each other. And to be clear, with very good reason.
mhm,
This is not like I'm not
mhm,
wagging my finger at them and saying, well, just let go of your anger and that'll make it all better. It's like, no, I get
mhm,
why you are hurt. And one of the techniques I have them do carefully with wisdom, hopefully with God's guidance, is I say, like, turn toward your partner, turn toward them and say what you just said with a softer voice, so to speak. or say it to them while looking in their eyes. And there's just something so powerful for us as humans. We are wired for nonverbal signals of safety and welcome. And so, and of course, what trauma does is it breaks that wiring. But when all it takes is for two people who are pointing the opposite direction to turn inward and face each other and start to use a soft voice and say, "You really hurt me. And I don't know how to recover from that. I think I want to, but I don't know how." Like that alone, I have literally seen people melt and cry in my office just simply by turning toward each other and not putting up the walls, putting up the defenses, sniping with the swords or the arrows. Yeah. So it's really powerful.
And that makes me wonder with the question, because I know, like, when you're trying to do this and work with people in a spiritual abuse situation, because that's invisible. Who do I look at? God's face is not visible. Christ is still not running around in the incarnated form on earth that he can come to each of our houses and sit down face to face with us. Like, how do I do that in a way that brings that same kind of unclenching? Because, like, so many of us that come out of spiritual trauma and church hurt come out so clenched and clenched in guard to God. How, with God opening his hands, how do I unclench when it's hard for me to see that, when that message that God has given us in this beautiful book, we have been beaten with it. How do I unclench to open up to that? Like, it just really makes me think about how you don't get those verbal cues.
You're right. No, you're so right. And that's one of the reasons why spiritual trauma is so insidious, is that God is the source of all goodness. God is the source of all love. And if quote unquote ordinary trauma does that to us on the like basic brain stem level, just think of how deep that runs down to the soul level when we can't even connect with love at all because our access to the fountainhead of love is cut off, or safety or beauty or any of those things. And of course, the tragic and cruel irony of it is exactly what you said, that like, well, how do we find that love again? Well, we go back and re-encounter it. But every experience of re-encountering it after the trauma is now coded with the trauma. And so just even walking into a building, seeing a building, hearing a certain line from a song, reading an article about a pastor that yet another one that had a public fall, like all those things reactivate, remember the traumatic experience and resever that connection to beauty and goodness and truth and love. And that's why this gets to be so insidious, is it's like making us allergic to the medicine that can heal us, the only medicine that can heal us. So how? What do we do about that?
How do we do that? How do we do that, Spencer?
Yeah, sure. Well, first of all, let me get you signed up for an intake session, and that'll start a lengthy process. But that's, I mean, I'm saying that tongue in cheek, but I am saying that semi-seriously, in that it's not something we can do on our own. It's something we have to do in community, perhaps only a community of two. It's something we have to do in a community of other people who tell us that we're not crazy, who help us to kind of be our reality testers, to be able to see things without the lenses that have become so ingrained in our experience that they're basically part of our eyeballs now. We need other people to heal.
Mhm.
And that's I realize with trauma wiring for protection and against connection, just how hard that is and how big of an ask that actually is.
Yeah.
And I don't say that lightly or easily. It is a really hard thing to do, but the work is worth it, and the reward is definitely there on the other side.
Yeah, I can see as we're getting to the 2-hour mark. So I definitely want to have you come back and we can continue some more of this conversation, because there's so much more ground we haven't even gotten to in
Yeah.
all of this. But I can say from personal experience that process of finding a place and that finding a group of people who can speak into that process, and sometimes you have to go to very unexpected places to
Yeah.
find it. Like I had to find a place that was so out of my context and so unfamiliar to me that
Mhm.
the messages that I grew up with didn't exist anymore.
Right.
They it that could um that process could start because those guards weren't there. So,
Right.
and then that community come in and say,
Mhm.
let us help you work past that and find that. It's an
Mhm.
amazing thing when you find that process. So,
Yes.
not giving up on that. Is
That's why I do the job I do. I love watching it happen. This is not like an ego boost for me at all. It's I just love watching people do the brave, scary, difficult work of taking those small steps and seeing the light come back on in their eyes. It is holy work, in my opinion. So,
Yep. All right. Well, thank you, Spencer. So, where can people find you? I put the link in the description, but where can people find
sure,
you, and what do you have coming up on
sure.
your channel?
Okay. So I do have so my handle on these socials is at Church Kid Pod. Um and that's the same for X, YouTube, Facebook. There's a discussion group that we have for the podcast that will where where we can kind of talk about both our personal experiences of church hurt, um, a, a safe place to ask questions, and also some discussion about the content of the podcast. The podcast itself is on all the major platforms. It's hosted through Podbeam, but it's on Apple, Spotify, um, Audible, YouTube, all that stuff. So,
All right. Well, we'll definitely have to have you back. We'll have some more of these conversations, because I think there's so many more layers to how difficult the Bible can be to read, and the the messaging that gets
mhm.
scrambled, that we definitely can do this a few more times, I'm sure, and maybe bring a couple of other of our friends here to talk about some
Sure.
more of their
Yeah.
experience and
Yeah.
stuff. So I think that would be
I
really
would
fun.
love
But thank
that.
you, thank you, Spencer. Everybody, if you haven't gone to subscribe to Spencer's channel and listen to his podcast, I would really recommend it. I am a big fan. I'm a big fan of Spencer's, which,
Thank you.
anybody who knows my history knows that that's an actually amazing statement to get to that point. So I love his content. I love what he's doing. I think it's fantastic. And even if you're not a survivor yourself, a trauma survivor yourself, giving you a way to talk to someone who is,
Yeah.
to understand
Mhm.
the stories, to talk to someone who is, and trying to help somebody else. Listening to his content so you can explain it and directing them to Spencer's content. So
Mhm.
absolutely go subscribe. If you haven't already, definitely do so. And we will definitely, and we'll see you back for Why Leviticus Matters Part 2 coming up next month, I think. So I know we're going to geek out on Leviticus. It's
I
going to
know.
be so awesome. All right, everybody. Thank you so much. And remember to take the Hesed in
Mhm.
our journey dwelling with Yahweh every day, because the Hesed is the thing that matters. All right, everyone, go and be blessed.